The gunfight at the OK Corral was a 30-second shootout between lawmen and members of a loosely organized group of outlaws called the Cowboys that took place at about 3 p.m. on Wednesday, October 26, 1881, in Tombstone, Arizona Territory. It is generally regarded as the most famous shootout in the history of the American Wild West. The gunfight was the result of a long-simmering feud, with Cowboys Billy Claiborne, Ike and Billy Clanton, and Tom and Frank McLaury on one side and Town Marshal Virgil Earp, Special Policeman Morgan Earp, Special Policeman Wyatt Earp, and Temporary Policeman Doc Holliday on the other side. All three Earp brothers had been the target of repeated death threats made by the Cowboys, who objected to the Earps' interference in their illegal activities. Billy Clanton and both McLaury brothers were killed. Ike Clanton claimed that he was unarmed and ran from the fight, along with Billy Claiborne. Virgil, Morgan, and Doc Holliday were wounded, but Wyatt Earp was unharmed. The shootout has come to represent a period of the American Old West when the frontier was virtually an open range for outlaws, largely unopposed by law enforcement officers who were spread thin over vast territories. The gunfight was not well known to the American public until 1931, when Stuart Lake published the initially well-received biography Wyatt Earp, Frontier Marshal 2 years after Earp's death. The book was the basis for the 1946 film My Darling Clementine, directed by John Ford, and the 1957 film Gunfight at the OK Corral, after which the shootout became known by that name. Since then, the conflict has been portrayed with varying degrees of accuracy in numerous Western films and books, and has become an archetype for much of the popular imagery associated with the Old West. Despite its name, the gunfight did not take place within or next to the OK Corral, which fronted Allen Street and had a rear entrance lined with horse stalls on Fremont Street. The shootout actually took place in a narrow lot on the side of C.S. Fly's photographic studio on Fremont Street, 6 doors west of the OK Corral's rear entrance. Some members of the two opposing parties were initially only about 6 feet, 1.8 m, apart. About 30 shots were fired in 30 seconds. Tom and Frank McLaury and Billy Clanton were killed. Ike Clanton filed murder charges against the Earps and Doc Holliday. The lawmen were eventually exonerated by a local justice of the peace after a 30-day preliminary hearing and then by a local grand jury. The gunfight was not the end of the conflict. On December 28, 1881, Virgil Earp was ambushed and maimed in a murder attempt by the Cowboys. On March 18, 1882, Cowboys fired from a dark alley through the glass door of a saloon, killing Morgan Earp. The suspects in both incidents furnished alibis supplied by other cowboys and were not indicted. Wyatt Earp, newly appointed as Deputy U.S. Marshal in Cochise County, then took matters into his own hands in a personal vendetta. He was pursued by County Sheriff Johnny Bein, who had received a warrant from Tucson for Wyatt's shooting of Frank Stillwell. Background: Tombstone, near the Mexican border, was founded in March 1879. After silver was discovered in the area, Tombstone grew rapidly into a frontier mining boomtown. At its founding, it had a population of just 100, and only 2 years later, in late 1881, the population was more than 7,000, excluding Chinese, Mexicans, women, and children, making it the largest boomtown in the Southwest. Silver mining and its attendant wealth attracted many professionals and merchants, who brought their wives and families. With them came churches and ministers. They brought a Victorian sensibility and became the town's elite. By 1881 there were fancy restaurants, a bowling alley, 4 churches, an ice house, a school, an opera house, 2 banks, 3 newspapers, and an ice cream parlor, along with 110 saloons, 14 gambling halls, and numerous brothels, all situated among a number of dirty, hardscrabble mines. Horse rustlers and bandits from the countryside often came to town, and shootings were frequent. In the 1880s, illegal smuggling and theft of cattle, alcohol, and tobacco across the Mexico-United States border, about 30 miles, 48 kilometers, from Tombstone, were common. The Mexican government assessed heavy export taxes on these items, and smugglers earned a handsome profit by stealing them in Mexico and selling them across the border. James, Virgil, and Wyatt Earp arrived in Tombstone on December 1, 1879, when the small town was mostly composed of tents as living quarters, a few saloons and other buildings, and the mines. Virgil had been hired as Deputy U.S. Marshal for Eastern Pima County, with his offices in Tombstone, only days before his arrival. In June 1881 he was also appointed as Tombstone's town marshal, or police chief. Though not universally liked by the townspeople, the Earps tended to protect the interests of the town's business owners and residents. Even so, Wyatt Earp helped protect cowboy Curly Bill Brocius from being lynched after he accidentally killed Tombstone City Marshal Fred White. In contrast, Cochise County Sheriff Johnny Bein was generally sympathetic to the interests of the rural ranchers and members of the loosely organized outlaw group called the Cochise County Cowboys, or simply the Cowboys. In that time and region, the term cowboy generally meant an outlaw. Legitimate cowmen were instead referred to as cattle herders or ranchers. Conflicting versions of events. Many of the supporting facts about the events leading up to the gunfight and details of the gunfight itself are uncertain. Newspapers of the day were not above taking sides, and news reporting often editorialized on issues to reflect the publisher's interests. John Clum, publisher of the Tombstone Epitaph, had helped organize a Committee of Safety, a vigilance committee, in Tombstone in late September 1881. He was elected as the city's first mayor under the new city charter of 1881. Clum and his newspaper tended to side with the interests of local business owners and supported Deputy U.S. Marshal Virgil Earp. Harry Woods, the publisher of the other major newspaper, the Daily Nugget, was an undersheriff to Bein. He and his newspaper tended to side with Bein, the Cowboys, some of whom were part-time ranchers and landowners, and the rural interests of the ranchers. Much of what is known of the event is based on a month-long preliminary hearing held afterward, generally known as the Spicer hearings. Reporters from both newspapers covered the hearings and recorded the testimony there and at the coroner's inquest, but only the reporter from the Daily Nugget knew shorthand. The testimony recorded by the court recorder and the two newspapers varied greatly. According to the Earps' version of events, the fight was in self-defense because the Cowboys, armed in violation of local ordinance, aggressively threatened the lawmen and defied a lawful order to hand over their weapons. The Cowboys maintained that they raised their hands, offering no resistance, and were shot in cold blood by the Earps. Sorting out who was telling the truth was difficult and remains so. Though usually opposing each other in their reporting of events, reporting by both the Epitaph and the Nugget initially supported the lawmen's version of events. Woods, the publisher of the pro-cowboy Nugget, was out of town during the hearings, and an experienced reporter, Richard Rule, wrote the story. The Nugget staff had a close relationship with Sheriff Bein, but Rule's story, as printed in the Nugget the day after the shootout, backed up the Earps' version of events. This varied widely from Bein's and the Cowboys' later court testimony. Subsequent stories about the gunfight published in the Nugget after that day supported Bein's and the Cowboys' view of events. Other stories in the Epitaph countered the Nugget's later view entirely and supported the lawmen. In addition, Dr. George Goodfellow, who examined the Cowboys after their death, told the court that the angle of the wound in Billy Clanton's wrist indicated that his hands could not have been in the air, or holding his coats open by the lapels, as witnesses loyal to the Cowboys testified. Part-time newspaper reporter Howell Pat Hayhurst transcribed the testimony from the hearings in the early 1930s as part of a federal writers' project, part of the Works Progress Administration. According to one report, Hayhurst was a friend of the Bein family. After he completed his transcription, he kept the original document in his home, where it was destroyed in a house fire. Origins of the conflict. Earps vs. Cowboys. The interpersonal conflicts and feuds leading to the gunfight were complex. Each side had strong family ties. The brothers James, Virgil, Wyatt, Morgan, and Warren Earp were a tight-knit family, working together as pimps, lawmen, and saloon owners in several frontier towns, among other occupations, and had moved together from one town to another. Virgil served in the Union Army during the American Civil War and in 1877 became a police officer in Prescott, Arizona. He followed that with a job as a night watchman before he became a constable. Wyatt had held 2 jobs as a police officer in the cattle drive towns of Wichita and Dodge City, Kansas. James, Virgil, and Wyatt Earp, together with their wives, arrived in Tombstone on December 1, 1879, during the early period of rapid growth associated with mining, when there were only a few hundred residents. Virgil was appointed Deputy U.S. Marshal shortly before he arrived in Tombstone. In the summer of 1880, Morgan and Warren Earp also moved to Tombstone. Wyatt arrived hoping he could leave lawing behind. He bought a stagecoach, only to find the business was already very competitive. The Earps invested together in several mining claims and water rights. The Earps were Republicans and Northerners who had never worked as cowmen or ranchers. The Earps quickly came into conflict with Frank and Tom McLaury, Billy and Ike Clanton, Johnny Ringo, and William Curly Bill Brocius, among others. They were part of a large, loose association of cattle smugglers and horse thieves known as the Cowboys, outlaws who had been implicated in various crimes. Ike Clanton was prone to drinking heavily and threatened the Earp brothers numerous times. Tombstone resident George Parson wrote in his diary, "A cowboy is a rustler at times, and a rustler is a synonym for desperado bandit, outlaw, and horse thief." The San Francisco Examiner wrote in an editorial, "Cowboys the most reckless class of outlaws in that wild country, infinitely worse than the ordinary robber." At that time during the 1880s in Cochise County, it was an insult to call a legitimate cattleman a cowboy. The Cowboys teamed up for various crimes and came to each other's aid. Virgil Earp thought that some of the Cowboys had met at Charleston, Arizona, and taken an oath over blood drawn from the arm of Johnny Ringo, the leader, that they would kill us. The Earps as lawmen. Among the lawmen involved in the OK Corral shooting, only Virgil had any real experience in combat, and he had far more experience than any of his brothers as a sheriff, constable, and marshal. The Earps' work as lawmen was not welcomed by the Cowboys, who viewed the Earps as badge-toting tyrants who ruthlessly enforced the business interests of the town. In direct conflict with the Earps' roles as lawmen, Johnny Bein was Cochise County Sheriff. Virgil Earp had served for 3 years during the Civil War and had also been involved in a police shooting in Prescott, Arizona Territory. He was appointed Deputy U.S. Marshal for Eastern Pima County by U.S. Marshal Crawley Dake, on November 27, 1879, before the Earps arrived in Tombstone on December 1, 1879. He was appointed acting Tombstone's town marshal, or police chief, on September 30, 1880, after popular Tombstone town marshal Fred White was shot and killed by Curly Bill Brocius. Only a few days later, Virgil ran for the office on November 12, 1880 but lost to Ben Sippy. However, on June 6, 1881, Sippy asked for a 2-week leave of absence. The city soon discovered $3,000 in financial improprieties in Sippy's records. A few days later Virgil was appointed as town marshal in his place. At the time of the gunfight, Virgil was both deputy U.S. Marshal and town marshal. The city suspended him as town marshal after Ike Clanton filed murder charges, and after he was wounded in an assassination attempt on December 29, 1881, Wyatt replaced him as deputy U.S. Marshal. After Wyatt Earp first arrived in Tombstone, his business efforts yielded little profit, and he took a job as a stagecoach shotgun messenger for Wells Fargo, guarding shipments of silver bullion. On July 28, 1880, Wyatt was appointed Pima County Deputy Sheriff. He held this position for only 3 months until after the election of November 9, 1880, when he resigned. When Virgil was maimed by an assassination attempt, Wyatt was appointed Deputy U.S. Marshal in his place. He held that position until he left Cochise County in April 1882. Wyatt Earp was an imposing, handsome man, blond, 6 feet, 1.8 m, tall, weighing about 165 to 170 pounds, 75 to 77 kilograms, broad-shouldered, long-armed, and muscular. He had been a boxer and was reputed to be an expert with a pistol. According to author Leo Silva, Earp showed no fear of any man. Wyatt had been an assistant marshal when he and policeman James Masterson, along with a few other citizens, fired their pistols at several cowboys who were fleeing town after shooting up a theater. A member of the group, George Hoyt, sometimes spelled Hoy, was shot in the arm and died of his wound a month later. Wyatt always claimed to have been the one to shoot Hoyt, although it could have been anyone among the lawmen. Wyatt had developed a reputation as a no-nonsense, hard-nosed lawman, but prior to the gunfight in October 1881, he had been involved in only one other shooting, in Dodge City, Kansas during the summer of 1878. The 1931 book Wyatt Earp, Frontier Marshal was a best-selling biography by Stuart N. Lake. It established Wyatt Earp's role as a fearless lawman in the American Old West and the legend of the gunfight at the OK Corral in the public consciousness. But Lake and many others in the popular media wildly exaggerated Wyatt's role as the central figure in the gunfight. It was only discovered much later that Wyatt Earp, Frontier Marshal, based on 8 interviews with Earp, was largely fictional. The book and later Hollywood portrayals embellished Wyatt's reputation and magnified his mystique as a Western lawman. Morgan Earp had no known experience with gunfighting prior to their arrival in Tombstone. While Wyatt was Pima County Deputy Sheriff on July 27, 1881, Morgan Earp took over his job as shotgun messenger for Wells Fargo. Morgan also occasionally assisted Virgil and at the time of the gunfight was wearing a deputy city marshal's badge and drawing pay. Doc Holliday had a reputation as a gunman and had reportedly been in 9 shootouts during his life, although it has only been verified that he killed 3 men. One well-documented episode occurred on July 19, 1879, when Holliday and his business partner, former Deputy Marshal John Joshua Webb, were seated in their saloon in Las Vegas, New Mexico. Former U.S. Army Scout Mike Gordon got into a loud argument with one of the saloon girls that he wanted to take with him. Gordon stormed from the saloon and began firing his revolver into the building. Before Gordon could get off his second shot, Holliday killed him. Holliday was tried for the murder but acquitted, mostly based on the testimony of Webb. Holliday had saved Wyatt Earp's life at one time and had become a close friend. He had been living in Prescott, Arizona Territory and making a living as a gambler since late 1879. There, he first met future Tombstone Sheriff Johnny Bein, a sometime gambler and saloon owner. In late September 1880, Holliday followed the Earps to Tombstone. Rural Cowboys vs. Tombstone interests. The ranch owned by Newman Haynes Clanton near Charleston, Arizona was believed to be the local center for the Cowboys' illegal activities. Tom and Frank McLaury worked with the rustlers buying and selling stolen cattle. Many of the rural ranchers and cowboys resented the growing influence of the city residents over county politics and law enforcement. The ranchers largely maintained control of the country outside Tombstone, due in large part to the sympathetic support of Cochise County Sheriff Johnny Bein, who favored the cowboys and rural ranchers, and who also grew to intensely dislike the Earps. Bein tended to ignore the Earps' complaints about the McLaurys and Clantons' horse thieving and cattle rustling. The Earps were known to bend the law in their favor when it affected their gambling and saloon interests, which earned them further enmity with the cowboy faction. Relevant law in Tombstone. To reduce crime in Tombstone, on April 19, 1881, the City Council passed Ordinance 9, requiring anyone carrying a Bowie knife, dirk, pistol, or rifle to deposit their weapons at a livery or saloon soon after entering town. The ordinance was the legal basis for City Marshal Virgil Earp's decision to confront the cowboys on the day of the shootout. Smuggling and stock thefts. In the borderlands south of Tombstone there was only one passable route between Arizona and Mexico, a passage known as Guadalupe Canyon. In August 1881, 15 Mexicans carrying gold, coins and bullion to make their purchases were ambushed and killed in Skeleton Canyon. The next month Mexican Commandant Felipe Neri dispatched troops to the border, where they killed 5 cowboys, including Old Man Clanton, in Guadalupe Canyon. The Earps knew that the McLaurys and Clantons were reputed to be mixed up in the robbery and murder in Skeleton Canyon. Wyatt Earp said in his testimony after the shootout, "I naturally kept my eyes open and did not intend that any of the gang should get the drop on me if I could help it." Earp loses sheriff's office to Bein. On July 27, 1880, Pima County Sheriff Charles A. Scheibel, whose offices were in the county seat of Tucson, appointed Wyatt Earp as deputy sheriff. On October 28, 1880, Tombstone Town Marshal Fred White attempted to disarm some late-night revelers who were shooting their pistols in the air. When he attempted to disarm Curly Bill Brocius, the gun discharged, striking White in the abdomen. Wyatt saw the shooting and pistol-whipped Brocius, knocking him unconscious, and arrested him. Wyatt later told his biographer John Flood that he thought Brocius was still armed at the time, and didn't see Brocius' pistol on the ground. Brocius waived the preliminary hearing so he and his case could be immediately transferred to Tucson. Wyatt and a deputy took Brocius in a wagon the next day to Tucson to stand trial, possibly saving him from being lynched. Wyatt testified that he thought the shooting was accidental. It was also demonstrated that Brocius' pistol could be fired from half-cock. Fred White left a statement before he died 2 days later that the shooting was not intentional. Based on the evidence presented, Brocius was not charged with White's death. The Tombstone Council convened and appointed Virgil Earp as temporary assistant city marshal to replace White for a salary of $100 per month until an election could be held on November 12. For the next few weeks, Virgil represented federal and local law enforcement and Wyatt represented Pima County. In the November 2, 1880 election for Pima County Sheriff, Democrat Scheibel ran against Republican Bob Paul, who was expected to win. Votes arrived as late as November 7, and Scheibel was unexpectedly re-elected. He immediately appointed Johnny Bein as the new deputy sheriff for eastern Pima County, a job that Wyatt wanted. A controversy ensued when Paul uncovered ballot stuffing by cowboys and he sued to overturn the election. Paul finally became sheriff in April 1881, but it was too late to reappoint Wyatt Earp as deputy sheriff because on January 1, 1881, the eastern portion of Pima County containing Tombstone had been split off into the new Cochise County, which would need its own sheriff, based in the county's largest city, Tombstone. This position was filled by a political appointment from the governor, and Wyatt and Bein both wanted the job. The Cochise County Sheriff's position was worth more than $40,000 a year, about $1,014,345 today, because the office holder was also county assessor and tax collector, and the Board of Supervisors allowed him to keep 10% of the amounts paid. Bein utilized his existing position and his superior political connections to successfully lobby for the position. He also promised Wyatt a position as his undersheriff if he was appointed over Wyatt. Wyatt withdrew from the political contest and the governor and legislature appointed Bein to the job of Cochise County Sheriff on February 10, 1881. Bein reneged on his deal with Earp and appointed Harry Woods as undersheriff instead. Bein said he broke his promise to appoint Earp because Wyatt Earp used Bein's name to threaten Ike Clanton when Wyatt recovered his stolen horse from Clanton. Earp conflicts with cowboys. Tensions between the Earp family and both the Clanton and McLaury clans increased through 1881. On July 25, 1880, Captain Joseph H. Hurst, of Company A, 12th Infantry, and commanding officer of Fort Bennett, asked Deputy U.S. Marshal Virgil Earp to help him track cowboys who had stolen 6 U.S. Army mules from Camp Rucker. This was a federal matter because the animals were U.S. property. Hurst brought 4 soldiers, and Virgil invited Wyatt and Morgan Earp, as well as Wells Fargo agent Marshall Williams. The posse found the mules on the McLaury's ranch on Babacomari Creek, northwest of Tombstone, as well as the branding iron used to change the U.S. brand to D8. To avoid bloodshed, cowboy Frank Patterson promised Hurst they would return the mules and Hurst persuaded the posse to withdraw. Hurst went to nearby Charleston, but the cowboys showed up 2 days later without the mules, laughing at Hurst and the Earps. In response, Hurst had printed and distributed a handbill in which he named Frank McLaury as specifically assisting with hiding the mules. He reprinted this in the Tombstone epitaph on July 30, 1880. Virgil later said that McLaury had asked him if he had posted the handbills. When Virgil said he had not, McLaury said if Virgil had printed the handbills it was Frank's intention to kill Virgil. He warned Virgil, "If you ever again follow us as close as you did, then you will have to fight anyway." This incident was the first run-in between the Clantons and McLaurys and the Earps. March Stagecoach Robbery and Murder. On the evening of March 15, 1881, a Kinnear and Company stagecoach carrying $26,000 in silver bullion, about $659,324 in today's dollars, was en route from Tombstone to Benson, Arizona, the nearest freight terminal. Bob Paul, who had run for Pima County Sheriff and was contesting the election he lost due to ballot stuffing, was temporarily working once again as the Wells Fargo shotgun messenger. He had taken the reins and driver's seat in Contention City because the usual driver, a well-known and popular man named Eli Bud Philpott, was ill. Philpott was riding shotgun. Near Drew's Station, just outside Contention City, a man stepped into the road and commanded them to hold. 3 cowboys attempted to rob the stage. Paul, in the driver's seat, fired his shotgun and emptied his revolver at the robbers, wounding a cowboy later identified as Bill Leonard in the groin. Philpott, riding shotgun, and passenger Peter Roerig, riding in the rear dicky seat, were both shot and killed. The horses spooked and Paul wasn't able to bring the stage under control for almost a mile, leaving the robbers with nothing. Paul, who normally rode shotgun, later said he thought the first shot killing Philpott had been meant for him. Suspects identified: Deputy U.S. Marshal Virgil Earp, along with temporary federal deputies Wyatt and Morgan Earp, Wells Fargo agent Marshall Williams, former Kansas Sheriff Bat Masterson, who was dealing faro at the Oriental Saloon, and County Sheriff Bein set out to find the robbers. Wells Fargo issued a wanted poster offering a $3,600 $1,200 per robber, reward for capture of the robbers, dead or alive. Robbery of a mail-carrying stagecoach was both a federal crime and territorial crime, and the posse consisted of both county and federal authorities and deputies. The posse trailed the robbers to a nearby ranch where they found a drifter named Luther King. He wouldn't tell who his confederates were until the posse lied and told him that Doc Holliday's girlfriend had been shot. Fearful of Holliday's reputation, he confessed to holding the reins of the robbers' horses, and identified Bill Leonard, Harry the Kid Head and Jim Crane as the robbers. They were all known cowboys and rustlers. Bein and Williams escorted King back to Tombstone. Suspect escapes Bein's jail. Somehow King walked in the front door of the jail and a few minutes later out the back. King had arranged with Undersheriff Harry Woods, publisher of the Nugget, to sell the horse he had been riding to John Dunbar, Sheriff Bein's partner in the Dexter livery stable. On March 19, King conveniently escaped while Dunbar and Woods were making out the bill of sale. Woods claimed that someone had deliberately unlocked a secured back door to the jail. The Earps and the townspeople were furious at King's easy escape. Williams was later dismissed from Wells Fargo, leaving behind a number of debts, when it was determined he had been stealing from the company for years. Earp pursues suspects. The Earps pursued the other two men for 17 days, riding for 60 hours without food and 36 hours without water, during which Bob Paul's horse died, and Wyatt and Morgan's horses became so weak, that the two men walked 18 miles, 29 kilometers, back to Tombstone to obtain new horses. After pursuing the cowboys for over 400 miles, 640 kilometers, they could not obtain more fresh horses and were forced to give up the chase. They returned to Tombstone on April 1. Bein submitted a bill for $796.84 to the county for posse expenses, but he refused to reimburse the Earps for any of their costs. Virgil was incensed. They were finally reimbursed by Wells, Fargo and Co. later on, but the incident caused further friction between county and federal law enforcement, and between Bein and the Earps. Wyatt offers Ike reward money. After he was passed over by Johnny Bein for the position of undersheriff, Wyatt thought he might beat him in the next Cochise County election in late 1882. He thought catching the murderers of Bud Philpott and Peter Roerig would help him win the sheriff's office. Wyatt later said that on June 2, 1881 he offered the Wells, Fargo and Co. reward money and more to Ike Clanton if he would provide information leading to the capture or death of the stage robbers. According to Wyatt, Ike was initially interested, but the plan was foiled when the three suspects Leonard, Head, and Crane were killed in unrelated incidents. Ike began to fear that word of his possible cooperation had leaked, threatening to compromise his standing among the cowboys. Undercover Wells Fargo Company agent M. Williams suspected a deal, and said something to Ike, who was fearful that other cowboys might learn of his double cross. Ike now began to threaten Wyatt and Doc Holliday, who had learned of the deal, for apparently revealing Ike's willingness to help arrest his friends. Earp, Cowboy Fallout. The fallout over the Cowboys' attempt to implicate Holliday and the Earps in the robbery, along with Bein's involvement in King's escape, was the beginning of increasingly bad feelings between the Earp brothers and cowboy factions. Earp and Bein attracted to Josephine Marcus. Wyatt Earp and Cochise County Sheriff Johnny Bein were interested in the same sheriff's position and also may have shared an interest in the same woman, Josephine Marcus, known as Sadie. Citizens of Tombstone believed that Bein and Marcus were married, but Bein was a known womanizer and had sex with prostitutes and other women. Marcus ended the relationship after she came home and found Bein in bed with the wife of a friend and kicked him out, although she used the Bein surname through the end of that summer. She rented her home sometime before April 1881 to a doctor, George Goodfellow. Wyatt Earp was still living with his common-law wife, Mattie Blaylock, who was listed as his wife in the 1880 census, but she had a growing addiction to the opiate laudanum. There are no contemporary Tombstone records that indicate a relationship between Marcus and Earp, but Earp certainly knew her, because both Bein and Earp had offices above the Crystal Palace Saloon. Sadie, traveling as either Mrs. J.C. Earp or Mrs. Wyatt Earp, left for Los Angeles on March 25, 1882, and then returned to her family in San Francisco. In July 1882, Wyatt left Colorado and went to San Francisco, where he sought out Sadie and his brother Virgil, who was seeking treatment for his arm. In February or March 1883, Sadie and Earp left San Francisco for Gunnison, where Earp ran a faro bank until he received a request in April for assistance from Luke Short in Dodge City. Sadie was his common-law wife for the next 46 years. September stage holdup. Tensions between the Earps and the McLaurys further increased when another passenger stage on the Sandy Bob line in the Tombstone.
Please subscribe and thanks for watching.